Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my stream. I Title of this one is probably a bit controversial, and the idea itself has the patina of controversy. I will admit. Um, I frankly would encourage those watching to analyze the content rather than value judge the claim. Right. So, or rather, analyze the content objectively rather than subjectively value judge the title of the video or my proposition, right? Uh, it is titled, right, intentionally, right, to be polemical and to provoke somewhat, because that seems to be what works when trying to disseminate ideas through the creation of media like this, commentary media or analytical media. So I the idea is that gerrymandering, right, should be mandatory. And I was thinking about gerrymandering, and I was thinking about you know we have these rather than virtue signal and take the position that gerrymandering is uh, well is okay. So let me be clear, right? Um, I use the term gerrymandering because it's close enough to what I'm proposing terminologically. It's ultimately the best way of expressing the idea that I'm trying to express. So let me get into the inner workings of my proposition and my argument. Um, we can talk about let's get beyond the surface and try to get into it a little bit. So why am I saying that gerrymandering is actually a good thing? Why am I saying that gerrymandering should actually be mandatory? Well, the key reason is because in this country we have a binary party dynamic. We have a binary uh, of parties that most people, right, according to the statistics I recently looked at, that most people, meaning 60%, which qualifies as most, I think, identify with, right? We have the Conservative Party in the United States. I recently moved to complete a master's in the UK, so uh, I'm speaking parochially about the United States now at a distance rather than in the midst of it. But in the United States, we have the Conservative Party, known as the Republicans, and we have the Liberal Party or the left wing party, known as the Democrats. And in terms of how left or right, you know, each party is, they operate on a spectrum, right? You have your moderate Republicans, which we call rhinos. You have your severe Republicans, uh, and you have a median, right? Um, with the Democrats, you have your Southern Democrats, which are somewhat more conservative, and you have your, uh, the generally speaking, and of course you have your severer Democrats like Kamala Harris, and uh, usually out of places like California, where I'm from, who are more severely, they're more severely liberal. Uh, so you have your severely liberal Democrats, your moderately liberal Democrats, uh, your more conservative Democrats. As I said, it's a spectrum, right, for each party. But generally speaking, there is an average for both that we can calculate or that we could observe. And generally speaking, Republicans represent the conservative temperament, and Democrats represent the progressive temperament. Um, all of those are statements of facts. Now, it's very telling that I believe it's around 60% of the population. I'll check that figure later again, but identifies with one or the other party, right? You also have, you know, identifiable, a large, almost half, right, of the American population. Um, all this is based on poll sampling and everything else. Um, so the polls can only tell us so much about the real identity of the samples can only tell us so much about the real identity of Americans, political identity or political affiliation of Americans. Um, but generally speaking, so that's about 40% of the population that doesn't really take a side between those two podes, bipodes, and rather, identifies somewhere in the middle. Now, the question that I ask is of independence, right? That's a very, very ambiguous term, right? I mean, there's no content to the term independent, really. It's just to say that you're independent, right? It's to say that you well, really what it says is, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but maybe you'd agree that really what this says is that I don't identify as either a Republican or a Democrat, right? That's all that is meant by independent. So it's a very ambiguous term. And I would imagine that among independents, you certainly have your liberal independents. I'm writing all this out for myself. And you have your conservative independents, right? I mean, this is just independent, the term independent. This could encompass a number of political persuasions and philosophical political persuasions, and it doesn't really mean much as a term. But I would suspect that even among the subset of the population that is independent, you do have your liberal leaning independents and you have your conservative leaning independents, meaning you have your whimsically or flirtatiously Republican independents and you have your, independents that flirt with the Democratic Party. And that's the thing, right? I mean, what I'm saying is proved by the fact that when it comes to actual voting among independents, they, right, I believe, I think it's a sound conclusion, although I would want to back this up. I'm not stating this as a fact, I'm stating it as a theory. I would argue that it's probably the case that even though they have no set, and I'm not sure whether independent voters can participate in primaries, right? I don't think they can, because then what you could have is a Republican. You could have sabotage. It opens the door to sabotage because then people can say Republicans or Democrats can say they're independent and then infiltrate the voting in the primaries and skew the result of the primary, right? To try to get a lesser opponent against theirs, right? Their incumbent. Um, or, yeah. So, in any case, notwithstanding that might be the case, we have, I would argue that, it only means that you're independent. You're not formally affiliated, right? But I would argue that there's some flirting among independents between your conservative independents and your liberal independents, and that it would probably split, right? So, notwithstanding that that's the case, um, I'm stating that because independents likely split either conservative or liberal, meaning either Republican or Democrat anyway, though they don't formally affiliate themselves because they differ significantly or insignificantly with either. I mean, it's just saying they've identified as independent. It doesn't even mean they are independent, right? Right? I mean, it just means that they call themselves independent, and that's a very limited. That people can call themselves independent and really just be Republicans or Democrats, right? They may not have enough information to say, and or out of ignorance may identify as independent rather than out of actual belief. So that being the case, I do wonder how independents split. And it's an oxymoron to say that you have an independent party. You can't have an independent party. That makes no sense because part of independent is not being affiliated with any party, right? So that also being the case, when it comes to actual voting, well, independents have to vote for someone in your presidential and congressional elections, and I would like to look at statistics as to how independents typically vote, right? So let's look that up. Actually, I think that bears on my argument here pretty significantly. So, how do yeah, as this article states, it kind of echoes what I'm saying. Um, Most independents are partisans too. Um, yeah, see, okay, so as I've said, this is an article by Pew Research, Political Independents, Who They Are and What They Think, um, states that, let me find that figure, an overwhelming majority of independents, 81% of them, continue to lean toward either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Among the public overall, 17% are Democratic leaning independents, while 13% lean toward the Republican Party. Um, okay, so that figures into my argument that independents are leaning one way or another anyway, which I think is inarguable and is only a natural consequence of human thinking and human psychology. So that's all very interesting. Um, Regardless, where was I? Okay, so in this country, right, we have 60% of the population identifies. I've argued in previous videos about why the parties are not a good thing, and why it doesn't exactly. Well, I mean, it's I argue I argue that they're you know they're myopic. It's really not that the parties are a bad thing, because parties have utility. They supply, and I think the fundamental utility justification for there being parties is that parties can supply candidates for elections. They can bring underdogs out of the weeds, fund them, and provide all the resources necessary, provide candidates for our elections. They serve an economic supply function in the political system. They supply candidates. They make it possible for underdog candidates to identify themselves so that those candidates can then appeal to a larger audience and gain office. So, you know, they have utility. That's not to say that all of their parties in general have utility. That is not to say that the parties aren't wrong on various issues in various ways and for various reasons. So I would say that only to state that parties have utility, not that they are an absolute necessity or we couldn't do without them. I'm just saying that they're a reality that we have to reckon with, and they're probably not going anywhere, right? I think this formation of political populations and voters into binaries of progressive and conservative camps is only a natural. It's only natural, and it's a very easy way of segmenting and identifying where people stand. So I think it's only natural that these types of conservative progressive dichotomies or binaries arise in human populations and political systems. So I won't go so much into the anthropology of parties, but I will state that they are, that in the United States, at least for the Republican and Democratic parties, it's been a while since we've had an independent party president. It's been a while since we've had a significant number of independent party, even though that's more of an oxymoron, congressional representatives or senators. So, I mean, I think Bernie Sanders is an independent, but okay, he's actually more of a socialist Democrat. So, it goes to the argument that independents lean one way or another anyway. Um, so, the party is probably even a necessary evil, but I'm not making any value judgments about them. Only to state that in the American population, so far as I've read, 60% of the population identifies with the party, one of these two parties, and even among independents, which make up then 40% of the population mathematically, 81% of them lean either way. So whether or not you're independent, you're leaning one way or another. So our population, political populations and voting populations, are divided into this binary between Republican and Democrat. That being the case, why am I then arguing that gerrymandering is actually good, or that it should be mandatory, or that something similar to gerrymandering is actually more appropriate in redrawing congressional districts? I think that, generally speaking, we should not be drawing districts for the sake of preserving a certain shape, or with an eye toward maintaining a certain geometry. I think that actually we should be thinking of districts being drawn not according to a certain shape, right? But according to a certain color, right? So that, typically you've got a bunch of, the way that you draw it out is, that's how things are drawn, right? You've got these each of these are separate districts. Another way of doing it is to draw according to color, right? And so different districts can bisect and intermingle and sort of jumble together, right? But the district is defined not by a shape or a certain geometry. It is defined by a color, right? So that different. It's hard to draw out or to explain, but so that different districts are actually, they're not drawn according to preserve a certain coherence, a certain geometry or a certain shape. They are drawn. They are not drawn. They're drawn, but they're drawn according to color, so that it's not that you have all of these districts. Looking at this image right here. Oh my God, what a mess. See this right here? What I'm pointing to at the top of the page? That's how districts look now, right? What you could do instead with like each district is like a certain shape, a certain coherent shape, and they all border each other. Really what I'm arguing for is that you could have like, a certain area, right? But it's a bunch of, so more like this is what I'm saying is more appropriate. Like districts still border each other in the abstract, but they intersect and bisect and jumble together, and they're not there's not as much geometric coherence or shapeliness to them. Rather, they're identified different separate regions, right, that are a part of the same district, are related to each other by color and not by by connectedness of shape or any kind of connectedness in geometry according to the drawings of the districts. Hopefully that's clear. Maybe in a second edition to this video, I'll have a whiteboard and I can better illustrate what I'm trying to describe. But that's how I spatially sort of envision what this would look like. And I think ultimately what you have now with the way that districts are drawn is you have, we think that it's better that districts be diverse, right? And that you have both Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Really, it's not, because what you have is either way, right? Even if there is diversity, one of those parties is going to win in an election because of how people identify and because there needs to be a majority. It's never going to happen, right? In large populations, it's simply never going to happen that you get an equal number of votes on both sides. It's going to be decided in favor of one of the parties just by the numbers and the astronomical improbability of a split vote. So, in any case, no matter how small a margin, right, decides an election, you're still going to have one of these parties winning. The problem with the way that districts are drawn now, and the problem with parties fundamentally and deciding elections on the basis of majority rule, right, through the plurality system of voting that we currently have, deciding the majority of the voters that turned out, that decides the election, rather than the total majority of the voters in general, not just those that turned out. You have this state of things where, yeah, one of the parties has to win. It's going to win. Then what happens? Well, you have the tyranny of the majority problem. Then there's a huge subset of the population, potentially, that is then simply not represented, right? Because of the way the districts are drawn for the sake of diversity and fairness, right? It creates this dynamic of things where you just have a large percentage of districts then not being represented in Congress at all, right? Because we can't really have a proportional representation system. We have a winner-take-all system. And if we're going to keep the winner-take-all system and our current methods of drawing districts, what's going to happen? you're going to have the tyranny of the majority problem exemplified. A large portion of the population simply not being represented in Congress. That's a problem. Which is why I actually think that because everyone's identifying with one of these parties anyway, it's simply better to draw districts so that Democrats are clumped together, so that Republicans are clumped together, so that ultimately when elections are held in those districts, the party that wins is actually the party that represents the majority of the population, right? Rather than representing only the majority of the voters that turned out and then imposing that majority will on a substantial minority. And with the current way of drawing districts, that's just how it plays out. So, this way, we could keep the winner-take-all system that we have rather than, which and majority rule, which is a necessity because we have a plurality voting system. We could keep all of that because it's convenient, but we also acknowledge that almost 100% of the population identifies with one of these two parties anyway, even independents. So we simply draw districts to clump members of certain parties together, so that ultimately, when the election results are turned out for those congressional election results are turned out for those congressional elections in these specific districts, what ends up happening is, the party that wins in those districts is actually the party that represents the majority of the district residents. And since, so ultimately I think that this is much better. If, by making, I'm arguing, by making, in some sense, gerrymandering mandatory or just a part of regular district drawing procedure, what we could have is a state of things where people are actually represented in Congress legitimately, rather than just having this system where we draw districts somewhat haphazardly for the sake of abstract and unachievable ideal factors like diversity or fairness or whatever, or the preservation of a certain shape. That combined with the current, way that we decide elections, which is through plurality majority, taking the plurality, right, of those that voted, and then, seeing who got the majority of the votes for the voters that turned out. Maintaining those two ways of doing things, sort of creates this dynamic where, we have this huge tyranny of the majority problem in these districts, these haphazardly sort of non-ideally drawn districts. So hopefully all of that's coherent. On this, my argument got a bit tangled up in my head earlier, so I wanted to come back and sort of offer a concise summation of what I'm arguing here. And it's that essentially, right, it's that in the current way of drawing districts, we have, we draw for the sake of maintaining a certain coherence of shape. Districts don't run through each other, and we try to maintain a certain level of coherency in that way when actually doing the drawing. And we look for things like party diversity and fairness. The idea is that we want to be objective and fair about who wins these districts. So it would seem logical then, right, that you'd then want some level of party diversity, right, to ensure that there is a fair chance, right? There's a fair electoral process in those districts. So there's that. And also, what decides, what party wins or what candidate wins on the congressional district level is that we have a winner-take-all system, right? Which is to say that the party or the candidate that gets the majority of the votes of the voters that turn out via the plurality system wins, right? So it's this winner-take-all system. We don't have a proportional representation system where you'd have actually two representatives, right? As many representatives from that district as there are parties, right? And so we have this winner-take-all system. But when you combine these two ways of doing things, determining who wins on the basis of winner-take-all, right, and drawing the districts in the way that we currently do, there's a problem that arises when those two procedures, one a voting procedure and the other a drawing procedure, are combined. And it generates the problem that what ultimately happens, especially if it's a close race, right? It's a close congressional race. What inevitably happens is that in this winner-take-all system, right, whoever gets the majority of the votes of the voters that turn out, that party, right, because it will always be one of the two parties that dominate, that party is represented in that district, right? The candidate, the winner that took all, right? The candidate representing a particular party. In that dynamic, it necessarily is the case then that the inevitable result is that that party, right, is represented, and the other segment of the voting population, right, the minority in that case, is not represented, right? And that's always the case when we combine, well, one, the way that we draw districts, and two, and the winner-take-all system, right? But when you have both the winner-take-all system, right, and essentially representing voters with different parties, it will always be the case that in that system, right, the winner that takes all, that party, right, behind that candidate, behind that winner, is represented, and the other party that forms the minority, the dominant minority in the population, and the rest of the population represented by other third or fourth parties, are not represented, right? So it's this essentially what the founders termed the tyranny of the majority problem. It's an exemplification of that. It's exactly what that is. So this dynamic, this combination of practices, processes, and procedures creates this tyranny of the majority problem, right? Because if the districts are drawn as such, so that there's a level of party diversity, there are both a good number of Democrats and Republicans in a district, we do that to ensure a fair election, right? Well, only one of the two parties is going to win, right? And it's a winner-take-all system which determines which party that is, right? So that inevitably leads to the case that if a Republican wins, Democrats are not represented, and when a Democrat wins, Republicans are not represented. So how, so that's the problem, right, that inevitably arises. And that's why I would suggest that we go about drawing districts in a different way, right? Not to maintain a certain coherent shape, not to ensure that there's party diversity, a good number of Republicans and Democrats, not to, that we instead make a kind of gerrymandering, or what I would call party clumping, right? Clumping voters and residents, neighborhood residents and district residents of the same party together, right? So that in the districts, following this clumping procedure, right, or this clumping distribution, which could also be called a kind of gerrymandering, mandatory gerrymandering, or practitional gerrymandering, making gerrymandering a matter of practice, rather than one of ethical violation, some sort of ethical violation. What this ensures then is that, well, we at least make it totally likely, right, drawing districts that way, that, if it's a predominantly Democrat district, right, Democrat identifying district, then a Democrat wins. And so essentially what this does is it ensures, this is a very big picture. This is an extremely complex constellation of a number of different principles and points of order. So it's putting it all into a concise video is rather difficult, I will tell you. But the easy idea, sort of the gisty takeaway idea from this, is that under this system, right, what actually happens is that, uh, as I note here, smaller percentages of people, right, are not represented, right? So, there always is this case with a, party democracy, right? That's based on some sort of winner take all system that if we're talking about a congressional district, for example, if the district is drawn as such, again, if a Republican wins, Democrats are not represented. If a Democrat wins, Republicans are not represented, right? So what the inevitable consequence of the standard way of doing things, the status quo, the procedural status quo at this point, is simply that greater and greater subsets of the population are not represented, right, at the congressional district level. And what inevitably happens is you have this tyranny of the majority problem arise that comes from this way of drawing districts for the sake of party diversity, combined with the winner-take-all system, leads to the state of things where, Republican wins, Democrats not represented, Democrat wins, Republicans not represented, leads to this inevitable state of things where large subsets of congressional district populations are just simply not represented. And the vote of that district as carried out or put forth by the winner that took all of a particular party is imposed upon the minority of that district that are not represented, hence the tyranny of the majority problem, right? So that's the inevitable result. We can say then that under that way of doing things, larger and larger subsets of the population are simply just not being represented at the congressional district level because of this tyranny of the majority problem that inevitably arises from the status quo. So drawing districts in the way that I've suggested, with a kind of gerrymandering, a kind of party clumping procedure, clumping, residents, voters, neighborhoods of particular party persuasions together, right? Instead of drawing districts for the sake of party diversity to ensure some sort of, a fair number of Republicans and Democrats to ensure a fair election or whatever. I think specifically in a mandatory procedural way, practicing a kind of gerrymandering, right? Drawing districts according to what the party persuasion is of a particular region, right? And clumping Democrats together and clumping Republicans together leads to a state of things where we inevitably have electoral results where either Democrats or Republicans still win, because those are the two dominant parties, right, in the country. We have a state of things where, if an election is, won by a Democrat in what we've drawn as a predominantly Democrat district, well then far fewer, right, Republicans that exist in that district, far fewer persons that exist in that district are not represented, right, are not imposed upon, far fewer people are imposed upon, or tyrannized by the majority as a minority. Essentially, what this would do is it would simply shrink. So one way that you perhaps get around this tyranny of the majority problem is, well, to me, a very logical way of getting around the tyranny of the majority problem is this. Because there's no, with a party democracy such as we have, drawing districts as we do, we have this plurality, winner-take-all system, whatever gets the majority of the votes, and as I've said, that inevitably leads to the tyranny of the majority problem, where the Democrats win, Republicans are not represented, and vice versa, right? I think, and so if we regard that properly as a tyranny of the majority problem, what that means is that, so we have to answer the question, how do we get around the tyranny of the majority problem, right? Well, I think the only logical, sort of the creatively logical way that you would do that is you can't, right? You ultimately can't, because in a democracy, in a party democracy, sort of winner-take-all democracy such as we have, we simply can't get around the necessity of there being, right, a tyranny of the majority problem because we decide who wins an election based off of who gets the majority of the votes. We decide on the basis of majority rule, and if we decide on the basis of majority rule, winner take all, as we do in a party democracy, that inevitably leads to the tyranny of the majority problem because we're deciding on the basis of majority vote, right? So we can't really get around the tyranny of the majority problem, but one creatively logical way that we could do this is we can't get around a tyranny of the majority, fine. Then simply limit the negative effects or the scope of the tyranny of the majority, perhaps by shrinking the minority, right, that would be subject to the tyranny of the majority, right? Making that minority, right, that is then not very articulately represented, right, making that minority as small as possible, right, so that this tyranny of the majority problem is simply not so great. So we can at least do that on the congressional district level, right? By redrawing districts with a kind of gerrymandering practice or a clumping procedure, clumping, Democrats into their own districts and Republicans into their own districts, and trying to limit, right, the number of Republicans in predominantly Democrat districts, and trying to limit the number of Democrats in predominantly Republican districts. And if that can be done well enough, what ultimately happens is, I mean, as I said, under the current state of things, drawing districts for the sake of shape coherence and party diversity, ensuring a fair number of Republicans and Democrats, which seems necessary to ensure a fair election, what it inevitably does when you have this winner-take-all, right, majority rule system in voting is that it even more logically creates the dynamic where, in this district, drawn for the sake of party diversity, the winner that took all, let's say it's a Republican, well, that then the district is simply represented Republican. All the votes cast by that district are Republican. There could be a substantial Democrat minority, which if the district was drawn for the sake of party diversity, there definitely will be, that are subject to the tyranny of the majority problem conceptually, and are just simply not represented at all by their congressman or congresswoman because they're Democrats and the district voted Republican, right? So that's the cynical. Well, that's just the reality of things with proceeding in this way. So I think the way that we get around this fundamentally is, instead of drawing districts for the sake of party diversity, ensuring a fair number of Republicans and Democrats to ensure a fair election, which on the surface seems more ethically valid, we clump Republicans and Democrats into their own districts, right? So that then we limit the number of, in the inevitable case that winner takes all, right? And the majority is represented and the minority is not, which inevitably happens. The way that you limit that negative, because you can't fully get around it, right? You can't eliminate that negative. You can only limit, right? So you can't eliminate the negative, but you can, shrink the scope of the negative or the magnitude of the negative. And you do that by clumping Democrats and Republicans into their own districts, by shrinking the size of the minority in each district that would be subject to the tyranny of the majority or would simply not be represented by their congressman or congresswoman. And in doing so, this sort of clever way of getting beyond the tyranny of the majority problem is simply because you can't really get around that problem in a democracy where we decide on the basis of winner take all, and we decide who wins an election on the basis of majority rule. We really can't get around some sort of a tyranny of the majority arising, or a non-represented minority arising. We can't get around it. All that we can do is logistically redesign things and rejigger our procedures so that we can sort of shrink the magnitude of the tyranny of the majority problem by shrinking in each of these districts through the procedure of uh, clumping Republicans and Democrats into their own districts, we can then shrink the size of the minority in each district that is not represented, right? Um, yeah, as the result of deciding things on the basis of majority rule, winner takes all. Um, so I think this may actually be better, which is why um, I guess the title of the video is sort of meant to provoke, not really to provoke. It's meant to be playfully polemical, right? It's not really meant to provoke anyone per se. It's simply meant to, um, it's sort of just meant to be witty, I suppose. But um, yeah, and adopting sort of this procedure, we can better um, well, essentially all that we're doing is by clumping Republicans and Democrats into their own districts, we ensure that in each of these congressional districts, because it's a basic fact of nature in the United States, that when Republicans, right, at least in the congressional district level, but certainly also at any level, when Republicans, it's sort of a general way of framing it, Republicans win, Democrats not represented, Democrats win, Republicans not represented, right? So, even if we have a split party government, even if we have a two-party government, um, what inevitably happens is, sorry, I was distracted for a moment. Um, it may be the case that either way. Now, here's the bigger picture here. This is an objection that I sort of came up with to my own proposal, um, which is this. Okay, so what, right? I mean, the general idea is, at least the general way of stating it is, so what, right? Um, it may be the case that at the congressional district level, um, the way the districts have been drawn for the sake of party diversity, right, ensuring a fair number of Republicans and Democrats. Let's say at that district level there was a close election. Republicans did win, though, which would logically mean via this, winner take all majority rule system, in districts drawn for the sake of party diversity, that you know there's going to be a substantial number of voters that are simply not represented, identifying as Democrat, and a more largely substantial portion of the voters that are represented that are Republican, right? So let's say that's the case. One could argue, one could object, or at least ask the question, the objectionary question, so what, right? Just because on your district level you're not represented doesn't mean that on the national level you're not represented. It could be that we have a one-party government, that, yeah, Democrats in your district didn't win, they aren't represented, Republicans dominated in that district, but on the national level we've got a one-party government ruled by Democrats, so we're still represented. Sure, that's the case. I mean, it's a good objection for what it's worth and what it is. The problem with the objection is that the way that we draw districts on the local level, on the congressional district level, impact, right, outcomes on the national level, right? So it's precisely in the way that we draw our districts that determine, which parties govern and which parties ultimately do rule on the national, congressional, and executive level. So it matters, regardless, that we draw districts articulately and with a sense not only of ethical principles, but an acknowledgement and a reckoning with the actual realities of of all of the different contradicting elements of our um, of our government structure, and there are many. There are many. Well, at least I've identified one main contradiction, at least in a system that claims to be a democracy. That if you decide on the basis of majority rule, um, even if you're a system that claims to be a democracy, that's still majority rule, where there's more representative power of the majority over the minority, which isn't very democratic. So that's one naughty issue that we've more or less could get around in various ways. But so those are the key ideas. Hopefully the title is not so controversial that the title is you know, downvoted, and the content is just not considered. Hopefully, the content will be considered, and hopefully, I've presented. It's a difficult argument to make because there are a lot of different there are a lot of different things at play, right? That would either make this whole proposal valid or invalid, and to advocate for what I call a party clumping procedure in drawing districts, um, which is almost a kind of gerrymandering. Um, it's definitely a controversial issue, but hopefully it's an interesting idea that I've managed to articulate more or less clearly. So in any case, thank you for watching, and hopefully everything was I was able to explain so that the ideas here can be digested. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe.